That's what people need to understand about Zionism, its various different agencies here, is that it's a maximalist ideology. It only tolerates complete submission. We need to concentrate on building up power within ourselves and understanding that we need to work outside those institutions and build alternative institutions. I still don't think we're there on that in terms of the new party, because Jeremy Corbyn's still writing articles for The Guardian. Why write articles for The Guardian? We don't have a media in the sense of how it's commonly understood. What we have is a propaganda system. And Gaza has exposed that, I think, like never before.
Hello and welcome to Attrition. I'm your host, Amar Kazmi. In this show, we delve into the forces of war, imperialism, and Zionism, exploring their impact on our world and what it will take to overcome them. I'm delighted to be joined today by investigative journalist and author Matt Kennard. Matt is the co-author of Silent Coup, How Corporations Overthrew Democracy, and the author of two other acclaimed books. He used to be a staff writer at the Financial Times in New York, Washington, D.C., and London. He then served as a fellow and later director of the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London, and he co-founded Declassified UK. He is now an independent journalist. Thank you very much for joining me today, Matt.
It's good to be with you, Amar.
I want to go straight into talking with you about Britain's active involvement, not just complicity, in the genocide that's being perpetrated in Gaza. In January 2024, you broke a story about how Britain had conducted 50 spy flights over Gaza in support of Israel. That number is now over 500. And you've continued to cover that issue, which until recently was totally not just ignored, but I would say covered up by the mainstream media. Before we get into how and why that mission has come to an end, could you give us a recap about what these spy flights are and what they're all about?
Yeah, well, as you say, these spy flights are the key component of UK support for Israel's genocide, which makes it active participation rather than complicity, because, and this is not just me saying this is legal experts, if you are providing intelligence from over a territory being attacked by a genocidal power, you are a party to that conflict. And you're giving intelligence, which to this day, we still don't know what that intelligence is, and we don't know what departments of the Israeli state they're providing it to. But these flights were announced in December 2023 by the Tory administration at that point. And it was just a government press release, and they did not say where they were going from, how long they were going to be in the sky, what plane would be used, or anything about it. And so I started looking on flight tracking websites and found where the plane was going from, which was RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus, which I'd been working on up to that point anyway, because that's the key international site for all the international support for Israel in terms of arms supplies, spies being sent, logistics support since the genocide started and continues now. But anyway, so I started seeing these flights go, saw that they were Shadow R1 planes, which are intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance planes, which can really get granular detail on the ground. And one of their main capabilities is target acquisition for military strikes. I saw they were going every day as well, and they've basically gone every day up till about a week ago. And they're in the sky for 6 hours. One of those hours is getting to and from Gaza from RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus, 5 hours over Gaza, just collecting intelligence. Now, we never knew what their flight path was over Gaza, because what happened was about halfway to Gaza, they turned the transponder off. And then on the way back, they turned the transponder back on. So there's massive amounts of secrecy around it, and also not just around the flights themselves, but around what intelligence is being collected and how it's being used by Israel. Because when they've had to defend it, the government, which is very little, because as you say, the mainstream media has barely covered it. In fact, they haven't covered it at all, really. But when they've had to defend it, when they've been asked questions in Parliament by MPs, who have, some of them have been quite dogged, all they say is, well, it's all to do with hostage rescue. And we only give intelligence to the relevant authorities. They never say what those relevant authorities are. But think about it. That's semantic wordplay. Israel characterizes their whole genocide as a hostage rescue operation. The relevant authorities for hostage rescue must be the occupation forces and their intelligence agencies, because they're the one leading the campaign. So I think we need much more will come out over the coming years. And hopefully, and this is why I believe that the ICC and the ICJ need to get involved, because the process of legal discovery would mean that we could get a lot of information that we can't as journalists, because we're talking about institutions and agencies within the UK state, which are the most secret parts of the UK state, the intelligence agencies, and they're not secret to defend us. Maybe there's a little bit of secrecy they need for their operations, but 95% of it is to defend themselves from us. But all this stuff has been got from open source. There's been no actual whistleblower from within the program. So if you started scratching the surface, I'm sure it would completely unravel, and you'd find out that we have been for nearly 2 years just active participants in a very direct way. So it's hugely important. I mean, this is, and it goes to what you were saying about the media. I sometimes can't understand how it's just, and a few other journalists, but it's basically been me covering this story. There's no more serious crime than genocide that a state can commit. And when you're talking about our government actively participating in it, this should be like every journalist in the country that's covering this stuff should be going any avenue they can to get the information, and there's been nothing. And I think it goes to the heart of what the media in this country is for. We don't have a media in the sense of how it's commonly understood. What we have is a propaganda system. And Gaza has exposed that, I think, like never before. Gaza has exposed many, many different myths that we live by in this country and globally. But one of the biggest ones is that we have this crusading free press, fourth estate, which holds power to account. We don't at all. It operates 99% of the time as a arm of the state itself. And the other 1%, when they're actually doing critical stories, they're always surface scandals. They're nothing that tells you anything about the systematic workings of the British state. And definitely don't tell you anything about the secretive agencies which have a lot of power in this country and basically never covered. So yeah, it's been a pretty eye-opening experience covering this stuff. And also the other thing, which I should mention, is SpyFights is only one component. And there's obviously the arms that have been going. 150,000 bullets were sent to Israel soon after October 7th, when the genocide started. They've been sending armored tanks, all sorts of different military equipment. They also have sent parts for the F-35 plane, which became controversial recently because they, when Labour announced a partial suspension of arms to Israel in September 2024, they carved out the parts for the F-35 jet, which 15% of which is produced in the UK, which is absurd. Because how can you say, well, our lawyers have said that any weapons that go to Israel that can be used in Gaza run the risk of being used in violations of international humanitarian law, and leave out the part which is the parts for the main bit of technology which is carrying out that genocide? It doesn't make any sense on a legal terms. And in fact, there was a recent case which was lost insanely by 2 human rights groups to try and get the government to stop the F-35 parts. Anyway, then there's also the SAS, which again is not talked about at all. In fact, there was the only mention of the SAS in Gaza was in the mainstream media. On October 27th, there was an article in The Sun, and this is how the SAS work. They're not against leaks, but they only do official leaks, and always there to present the SAS as this heroic institution. So in October 27th, 2023, there was an article in The Sun, which was based on sources saying that the SAS had deployed to Cyprus for Gaza operations, heroic hostage rescue operations. Following day, a D notice was sent out by the Ministry of Defence to all media to say you can't publish anything more about UK Special Forces in Gaza. To this day, there's not been a single bit of information which has come out in the media about what those special forces have been doing. I actually recently published that D notice because I got hold of it. And well, again, it goes back to the media point. I mean, and means they're complicit. If they have received information about our special forces being involved in Israel or on the ground in Gaza, it's not preposterous to think that could have happened. And they've not published it because they've been told by the Ministry of Defence that there's a D notice. They're complicit because the D notice is officially voluntary. So there's not even any punitive. I mean, there might be sort of like unofficial punitive measures that can be taken against newspapers, but the fact that we've had no more information, the fact that they kept that D notice secret, the D notice I published for the first time had gone to every single media editor in the UK, and not one thought it would be the right moral thing to publicize it. The only way we knew about its existence was a socialist worker wrote a story about it. They didn't publish the D notice itself. But that was a big service in itself. But so it's deep complicity. I don't think you can think of the Gaza genocide as just an Israeli genocide. It's and I'd say this all the time, so I'm sure people are bored of hearing it, but it is a tripartite genocide. It's the US, it's the UK, and it's Israel. Now, the US providing the vast majority of the arms, also special forces, by the way. It was reported early in the genocide that US special forces had been deployed to Israel. Britain providing the majority of the intelligence, it seems, or that's their role, and Israel getting it done because, and I'll finish with this, just on the spy flights where we started, subsequent to the work we were doing, there was an investigation by Al Jazeera into reconnaissance flights over Gaza. This came out last year, 2024. And they found that 47% of all reconnaissance flights over Gaza were flown by the RAF, which was more than double Israel itself. So how are you not a party to a conflict if that's the stats that have been gathered from open source intelligence? That and the UK government admits they're giving that intelligence to Israel. They don't say what departments or what it's for, or apart from hostage rescue. But to me, there's no confusion. If we lived in a world which actually applied international law, UK ministers would be getting arrest warrants from the ICC now. And again, we talk a lot about Starmer and Lammy and John Healey, who's the defense secretary, but this also goes for the previous Conservative administration, who started the spy flights themselves. So Rishi Sunak, Grant Shapps, who was defense secretary, David Cameron, who was foreign secretary. So there's a whole coterie of war criminals that have served in the UK government and been complicit in, and participants, in fact, in one of the worst crimes in modern history, maybe in all history. So it's going to take years of work to unravel the reality of what's happening, because, as I say, what we know now is the result of independent journalists using mostly open source stuff. So as soon as over the years, when we get more whistleblowers, when we get more information, hopefully from legal cases and other avenues, we'll get a much more full understanding. And that's why I always say, like, this won't stop when the genocide finishes. This is years of work that we're all going to be dedicated to, because we have to hold the people that are accountable for this to justice, because if we don't, then we just accept that we live in a genocidal world and the law of the jungle rules, and we can't accept that. So it's imperative to stop it happening again, but also just to stop the complete disintegration of our society, that we hold accountable the people that did this. And obviously, we have some hope in the ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, because although they took too long, that's the first time Western leaders have been, and our allies have been prosecuted, despite us being the most violent and war criminal countries in the world. So the fact that that threshold was crossed means that the idea that our own prime minister or the US president, or it would be hard for the US president because they're not part of the ICC, but, you know, the people that we assume, and people would be shocked if you said they're going to be in a restaurant. We need to change that idea, and we need to understand that the ICC was essentially created as an imperial tool, and it was created to go after official enemies, which is what it did up to the Gaza genocide.
I agree completely on that. And I think that the reckoning for the genocide in Gaza is going to occupy a large part, if not the rest of our lives, because we're going to have to investigate, track, and prosecute all those people who are accountable. And that's not just politicians, but everyone complicit or active in this genocide. You've also said that Britain has now ended its spy flight mission over Gaza. Why do you believe that the mission has definitely ended, without revealing your source, obviously?
Yeah, I can't really say too much, but there's a big twist, and it doesn't absolve the British of responsibility in what's continuing. It sounds like a lawyerly way to say it, but again, that they haven't announced anything. They don't talk, and when you ask them as a journalist, because I did a year of stories for Declassified. I've carried on doing them for Dropsite News and others, and whenever I approach the Ministry of Defence, which I do for every story, they never ever give any information. They always just come out of a blanket statement. So you are guessing, and you have to piece together the evidence you've got and information you're getting. But I can't say much more. But
Well, we look forward to hearing the twist to this story. And of course, we praise you for the work that you've done in exposing all of this. I think because of your doggedness in pursuing the government on these sorts of matters, you were even blacklisted at one point by the UK Ministry of Defence.
yeah, that was earlier on at Declassified. That was actually a very salutary tale of how the media system worked. That happened like about a year into us founding Declassified. And I did a story basically about how MI5 and MI6 were training spies from some of the worst dictatorships in the world, like the Saudis, the Egyptians, the UAE, at a base called Chicksands, just outside London. And like always, I contacted the MOD for comment because it was an MOD course that they were training them on. And they just didn't respond. And then I called them and they said, we'll get back to you. And they didn't respond. So I was very they never do this. This is the first time this has happened. And then a couple of weeks later, there was a protest by Ahmed al-Batati. I don't know if you remember him.
Yes.
He was a Yemeni soldier. Oh, sorry, he's a British soldier, but British Yemeni, who was serving in the Ministry of Defence and went out in his fatigues outside the Ministry of Defence and blew a whistle every minute to symbolize how many Yemenis were dying because of the British war in Yemen, which it was a British war. It wasn't just a Saudi war. He got arrested by military police and then discharged. But anyway, when he was taken in, Phil Miller, my colleague, contacted the Ministry of Defence for comment about what had happened to him, what the process was, and they didn't get back to him. And then he called them again, and he was recording the call, and the officer and the press officer said, "Oh, we don't deal with your publication anymore." Which is a contravention of the Civil Service Code, by the way, because you have to interact with all journalists despite their political affiliations or style of journalism. And then they probably thought, well, this is a small website, nothing's going to happen. But it escalated, and a Council of Europe media alert was sent out, level 2, which is quite a big deal, and also means, because the Council of Europe, the UK's part of, meant that the Ministry of Defence had to respond. So anyway, Ben Wallace, who was then Defence Secretary, ordered a inquiry, which was carried out by Tony Blair's former spokesperson, not Alistair Campbell, another one. And he published a report which showed essentially that we'd been blacklisted, but yet Ben Wallace still didn't accept that there was a blacklisting in his place. He said it appeared to many people in the press office that it was a blacklisting. It was just like legalese. But the interesting thing was that whole report, which was quite shocking, by the way, it was like anonymous military officers said, we need to put them on a list of hostile media organizations. You don't know what that means within the context. So they published that report, which was a long report, very, very shocking and worrying for the free press. Ben Wallace gets up in the House of Commons, apologizes to Declassified UK, which is kind of unprecedented. And still to this day, not a single word about it has ever appeared in the mainstream media, which is crazy. Because when you talk about that level of response, like you would imagine, and the Council of Europe, you expect that the mainstream media, who you would think would defend fellow journalists who are actually doing proper work, unlike them, they didn't. But that was, again, it goes to show that the Ministry of Defence just did not know how to deal with journalists who, I mean, we were, and they still are, don't take any state or corporate funding, completely independent, not working for any hostile powers or anything. But they just couldn't accept journalists, or didn't understand journalists that were asking questions in a critical way to try and find out information that the government didn't want out. Like literally, if you look at the main defence correspondents from like Jonathan Beale at the BBC, Deborah Haynes at Sky News, nearly everything they publish is just a reworded MOD press release. It's shocking.
Well, Jonathan Beale recently decried the reporting on these spy flights. I think he attacked Des Friedman and also maybe John McAvoy at Declassified for reporting on it. And he asked, I'm paraphrasing, whether they had access to some secretive, privileged information. And it's like, well, this is all publicly sourced. If you're doing your job, you would have also discovered this.
It's a mindset. That's the interesting thing. That's my take on the propaganda system. It's not that he is being controlled. It's just that he has not ever got in his head an idea that he wants to find out information that the government doesn't want out, because he's so immersed in that mainstream media world, especially at the BBC, where you're just an appendage of the state, that the thought to actually maybe do a bit of independent research never crosses his mind. It's that Noam Chomsky interview with Andrew Marr, when Andrew Marr says, "Do you believe I don't think what I say?" And he said, "No, you think what you say, but you wouldn't be where you are if you thought any different." So anyone who does critical journalism gets filtered out way before they get to the level of Jonathan Beale, and that's the way it works. And that's why, and that's why it's quite funny when they respond like that, because they're not aware of it. They always say, "Well, I can write what I want and I can do what I want." It's like, well, that's because you never say anything that the state doesn't like. If you did, you'd soon find out that they wouldn't allow you to continue. But it's but as you say, I mean, you say they're active participants. I'd say they're complicit, definitely, because if you like to go back to the F-35 September 20 and the 2024 suspensions by Labour, right? That only happened because when the media has focused on UK role, it's always on arms, which is good. Like, obviously, I think there should be a complete arms embargo. There should have been one a long time ago. But the government was pressured by that media pressure and mainstream media pressure. If that mainstream media had borne that pressure on the spy flights, they would have been grounded a year ago or more.
Well, also, just speaking of complicity, you recently broke a story that numerous Israeli jets have been active in perpetrating the Gaza genocide have been landing in Britain.
Yeah, mad. Again, not picked up at all by the mainstream media, as it never is. But yeah, that's and again is active participation, because these are Israeli tankers. They're called Ream air-to-air refueling planes. Yeah, they landed at Bryce Norton 9 times at least. That's what we could find. I'm sure there's more. But they landed at RF Bryce Norton, all under the Labour government. And then days later, on some occasions, they were flying off Gaza, refueling fighter jets when there were massacres of nearly 100 people in one in Bet Lahia. And it just got. And then recently, the head of the Israeli Air Force came and attended the air tattoo at a UK military base. This is a guy that is basically the architect of, in terms of the air war, of the genocide, and he's been welcomed by the Labour government. It is astounding, the level of complicity and participation. And it goes to the fact that I think that effectively we are occupied by the Israeli state in many ways through different mechanisms. One is the official Israel lobby, like the Israeli embassy and its various different agencies, but also through the groups they have within our political system, like Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel, which are front groups for the embassy, both of whom don't reveal their funders. But in that Al Jazeera documentary, The Lobby, Michael Rubin, who was then the parliamentary officer for the LFI, was recorded outside a pub saying, "Well, we work closely with the embassy and they send us things to say when there's trouble for Israel." So effectively, everything you see posted, every statement you see posted by LFI is probably drafted by the Israeli embassy, highly likely. That's one section. Then there's the other section, which is nominally Jewish groups that are meant to represent Jewish interests or Jewish communal interests that have been infiltrated by the Israeli embassy and the Zionist movement and made to work, like the Jewish labor movement. There's not hard evidence of links to the embassy, although Ella Rose was at the Israeli embassy and then became head of Jewish labor movement, I think. But it's clear from their statements that they're basically operating as an Israel lobby group. The same with the
Well, I mean, even in the Jewish labor movement constitution, they're bound to support Israel.
Exactly, yeah. And the Board of Deputies of British Jews, right, which is, again, presents itself as a Jewish communal group representing the community in Britain. It's explicitly a Israel lobby group, because if you look at the parliamentary records of ministers' meetings, they say the Board of Deputies is coming in, and what do they say they're talking about? Israel, Palestine, and they're arguing the case for Israel. It's see-through. So you've got that element as well. And then you've got the media that is and that these organizations play a role. But the other way that we're occupied is there's various mechanisms that can be used to stop the ascent of a leader who might take decisions which are to the detriment of Israel, which we saw very clearly with Jeremy Corbyn. And he gets criticized for not being radical enough on his Israel policy, which, fair enough, I agree with that. But in both manifestos, he said there would be an arms embargo on Israel in terms of weapons that could be used in human rights violations against Palestinians. Like that was completely unprecedented. I don't think it ever appeared in the mainstream. And how was he destroyed? One of the main mechanisms was that the bogus anti-Semitism campaign, which began as soon as he was elected leader. So
before that, actually.
well, before that, and actually Ed Miliband, who was the leader before Corbyn, he also came under, because he wanted to recognize Palestine. People forget this whole episode, and there was a whole fake anti-Semitism thing around him as well. So there's various mechanisms which mean it's very, very hard, in fact, maybe impossible for the British state and its different agencies like the military to put a hand up and say no to Israel. And that's just the proof's in the pudding. If we're inviting a guy who's the head of the Air Force when his boss, the Prime Minister, has an ICC arrest warrant out to the UK to talk for meetings, that something's wrong. If we're allowing the Israeli planes that are involved in the bombing of Gaza, which has been orchestrated by a Prime Minister who's got an ICC arrest warrant out, how that doesn't make sense in any way, unless to say that the British state is not acting in its own interest or in our interest. It goes, I mean, there's another example I've looked into, which is the prescription thing, right? Prescription of Palestine Action was pushed by the Israel lobby. Prescription of Hezbollah was pushed by the Israel lobby. Both those things, I think, if even the British establishment had control over the things, wouldn't have done. One, because Palestine Action is so preposterous, it's just it's become unworkable, and it's an embarrassment now. On the Hezbollah thing, they got two ministers in the Lebanese government. The British government don't want to, in terms of British national interest, they don't want to alienate and make it impossible to negotiate, to deal with people in positions of power
well, this is why I think Britain has lost a lot of its diplomatic capital around the world, particularly through this prescription regime, which is why global diplomacy now doesn't happen out of London. It happens out of Doha in Qatar and other places. And just on this question of the prescription of Hezbollah, you mentioned the fact that this was done at the behest of the Israel lobby, which I think is absolutely true. The political wing of Hezbollah was prescribed in 2019. There wasn't some sort of escalation at that time with Hezbollah, but what was happening was that Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, and despite the problems that he had when it came to Palestine, he was nominally a pro-Palestinian leader whose government would have recognized Palestine and possibly could have implemented some kind of boycott, divestment, and sanctions regime against Israel. And so it was a way of attacking him and the pro-Palestine movement by proxy. And of course, it was also a long-term objective of the Israel lobby here in Britain. Anyway, and you also mentioned that until recently, Hezbollah had two government ministers. They continue to have, numerous MPs in the Lebanese parliament, even though they're no longer in the government. And of course, they're a huge factor in Lebanese politics more broadly. I mean, Lebanon is a country which we surely want to be friendly with, and Hezbollah was until recently part of a government there with which we have diplomatic relations.
Exactly. And also, by the way, interesting that you mentioned it, when it happened in 2019 when Corbyn was the leader, they didn't oppose it, funnily enough, which is a story that doesn't get talked about, but they should have. But it showed how much pressure they were under and how they were wilting under that pressure. But it was quite explicitly the work of the Israel lobby in that case, because Lord Polak, who is kind of like the dean of the Israel lobby in this country, he did an interview which was posted on YouTube where he was talking about the Israel lobby's current concern, or it was then and still is, to get the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, prescribed in the same way. And he said, all we need to do is straight lobbying. With Hezbollah, it took us ages. So he's admitting that it was an Israel lobby thing. Then in Alan Duncan's diaries, he was a minister. He was a Tory minister for the Americas and Europe from 2016 to 19. He was a Tory minister when the prescription happened. And he said, like, he was in the Commons, and he said that Israel's troops in the Commons have got this done. Sajid Javid, Priti Patel, others. He says that explicitly in his diaries. And Alan Duncan is not a fringe figure or conspiracy theorist. In fact, he's got odious politics in many things, but his position on Israel is just that he wants Britain to be a sovereign country.
Well, 100%. And he had skin in the game because Shai Massot,
Exactly.
the Israeli spy who was kicked out of Britain, was trying to bring down Alan Duncan. And you mentioned that he's not a fringe figure. He was a close ally of Theresa May and was, a minister in her government. And his diaries are quite stark, actually, in terms of the influence and control, at least within the Conservative Party, that he describes the Israel lobby wielding in Parliament.
Yeah. I actually think it's the best window we have into it. I read the whole book and did a story for Declassified at the time about what it revealed about the Israel lobby. And I mean, it's shocking, even for someone who is aware of the level of penetration. I mean, there's a line where he's talking to the permanent undersecretary in the Foreign Office, and he says something along the lines of, the Israelis think they control the Foreign Office, and they do. That's the quote. Obviously, that quote never got into the mainstream media. And he talks about the case with Shai Massot. He talks about the proscription of Hezbollah. And he talks about the fact that even his position that he was appointed to in Theresa May's cabinet, right? He was, as I mentioned, he was Minister for the Americas and Europe from 2016 to 2019. Now, he was originally slated to be Minister for the Middle East because he's known as the Middle East guy. He's a good friend of all the Gulf dictators, and he's that very sort of Arabist Foreign Office. And in his diaries, he goes through the process of like Boris Johnson approves it, Theresa May approves it, and then they get a call from Lord Polak. This is Theresa May or her personal assistant, and Lord Polak and Eric Pickles, and they say you can't appoint Alan Duncan Minister for the Middle East. And Alan Duncan's sort of saying, well, this is the Prime Minister of Britain. She's going to tell them to go away. She doesn't. She then informs Boris Johnson, who's his boss at the time, he's Foreign Secretary, oh, we can't appoint you the Middle East Minister. And then Alan Duncan's shocked, and he's like, well, can't we just say that I'll be Middle East Minister, but we'll leave out the brief of Israel-Palestine? So they're basically trying to carve out Israel-Palestine because to accede to the Israel lobby. So they put that back, and that gets rejected. And they say, sorry, we can't appoint you Middle East Minister. We're going to have to appoint you Minister for the Europe and Americas. So what you have in that case, and Boris Johnson, by the way, one of the quotes that in this conversation, he said, the Israelis always do this. How can they get away with this? Even Boris Johnson is aware of it privately, and talks about it. But what you have there is a situation where agents of a foreign regime, because Lord Polak is basically working for Israel within the UK, are overruling the democratically elected Prime Minister of the country. And that's just from a phone call. That is a shocking state of affairs. And from his diaries, it's also clear that everyone within the Foreign Office is aware of this. Like, they can't say it publicly, but he does. But the other important thing about it is does Alan Duncan think? This is an old school Tory guy. He's basically, his official position is the same position as the UK government, which is that settlements need to go, there should be a two-state solution, blah, blah. That's all he says. He's not radical in any way. He's not an anti-Zionist. He's a moderate. He's the same as the Conservative Party on their official policy, but that's too much for the Israel lobby. And that's what people need to understand about Zionism, its various different agencies here, is that it's a maximalist ideology. It only tolerates complete submission. And complete submission in this case means that you can't support a two-state solution because they never have supported the two-state solution, really. They're not going to tolerate a Palestine on its borders with a military or any kind of independence, its own independent intelligence agencies or anything. It's not going to happen. So anyone even vocalizing, the crime is to vocalize the government's official position. And if you go for that and destroy him, which is what Shai Massot was, it was exposed, then you can maintain this kind of complete control. And then they tried to use the other mechanism against Alan Duncan when he left government. There was a whole investigation of him for anti-Semitism, of which he was eventually cleared. But again, it's quite a revealing study in how the Israel lobby in this country, how powerful it is, but also how it operates.
Well, their modus operandi is that a threat to Israel anywhere, no matter how small, is a direct threat to the continuation of their colonial state. And so they have this completely maximalist, as you said, way of operating in which they will try to ground people who speak against them into fine dust, whatever they're saying or whatever they're doing. Although, of course, they're now badly losing the propaganda war. But this is obviously the nature of the sort of forces that are ranged against us, at least, from a British perspective. And I want to take this conversation now into this new left-wing party, which is going to be created under the stewardship of Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. Many people, myself included, have expressed concerns about mistakes that were made when Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party between 2015 and April 2020. For my part, I was an active member of that pro-Corbyn movement at the time. I worked for a pro-Corbyn member of Parliament. And especially towards the end, I started to notice that Corbyn and the people around him were making terrible decision after terrible decision, particularly around the anti-Semitism smear campaign. And perhaps the worst incident was when a pamphlet was circulated in 2018 to all Labour Party members, which was written by someone who worked in Corbyn's office, which said, "For many Jews, Zionism represents national liberation. The concepts of Israel, Zion, and Jerusalem run deeply in Jewish religion, identity, and culture." It said, "The sensitivities around these concepts should be considered before using them." It also said, "Labour is a political home for Zionists and anti-Zionists. Neither Zionism nor anti-Zionism is in itself racism." Now, looking at this in 2025, after 2 years of genocide, that sounds absolutely horrific. But of course, it was horrific at the time. And this sort of Jewish supremacism was a hallmark of that era. So surely after everything that we've experienced in this new party, anti-Zionism, real anti-Zionism, is an absolute red line.
Yeah, I think it should. And I think we're in a new period in terms of attitudes to Zionism, and the new party needs to reflect that. That's absurd what you just read out, and immoral as well. But I think it was reflective of the time. You couldn't say anything. Like people like me and you we would talk about Zionism at that point, and the fact that the anti-Semitism campaign was a campaign and it was bogus. But we were completely marginalized, called cranks. There was.
We spoke about it in quite mild terms, I should say.
I know, yeah.
We weren't like radical, pioneering anti-Zionists, which I would say against me as well. I would say sort of not to exculpate myself.
I know
from what happened during that period. Of course, we were making a stand, but it was quite a mild stand. Even that wasn't.
And actually, I said this when the genocide started. I said I feel guilty, and I think we all failed because of that. Because it wasn't a conscious fear, but I was asking myself, why have I not been more outspoken on this? Obviously, I talked about Zionism and the fact I was an anti-Zionist, but the debate was so controlled that anything you said was what made you appear completely off the charts. But I do think that's changed now, right? That has changed. And in fact, when the genocide started, I was saying to friends and other journalists, like, this is an opening. I mean, it's a horrific opening, but this is an opening now that we need to get rid of that red line that there has been for so long about Zionism, because that red line is imposed by the Zionist entity. So if you're acceding to it, then you're playing by the rules of that entity. And the reason it's protected is because it's indefensible. So once you start scratching the surface, once you start critically analyzing it, you realize it's completely at odds with any kind of progressive understanding of the world. And that's why it has to be protected. It's a settler colonial ideology. It's an ideology which uses religious, hijacks religion to support the imposition of a settler state on a country which has an indigenous population, which is much more populous. And the other, it's the equivalent of supporting Manifest Destiny in the United States. It's no different. That the British colonists used Christianity to say that God had given them the United States. It was a shining city on the hill, and they wiped out the Native Americans, moved them all, put them on reservations, which they still are on, using that there's no difference. And can you imagine a Labour Party supporting that? But we're allowed to talk about that now because it's history. It's not as controlled because there's many forces now protecting Zionism. But yes, I think it would be quite a statement to say we're an anti-Zionist party. And what does that mean? Because the other problem with anti-Zionism as a concept is negative, right? You're saying you're anti something, but actually the idea behind it is very positive. It's saying one state from the river to the sea where everyone lives in equality, Jews, Arabs, Palestinians. Although, having said that, millions of Israelis have been served in the IDF, so there needs to be some legal mechanism for putting them all on trial.
Well, people also talk about a process of de-Zionization, because at the moment, if the internal borders within historic Palestine were disintegrated and it was one state, that functionally wouldn't work, nor would it be just, obviously, because you have potentially millions, right, of radicalized Jewish supremacists who don't even accept Palestinian humanity. You see a microcosm of that in the West Bank, where you can see how the colonists harass and kill Palestinians all the time. So a question needs to be asked about this one democratic state. How would it actually function? What are the processes, not just the legal processes, but what are the broader processes to have a functioning society?
Well, the other point is they're never going to allow it, the Israelis, are they? So I meant it more as kind of a goal and a banner, that we should have that as our goal, and it's a progressive goal. I mean, the Algeria case is that millions of settlers left, so that's also an option. But I again, it's not something that we should. It's for Palestinians to put a vision forward for what one state would look like, because they're the victims of this settler colony. But I think, as you say, as a goal, that's what we should be going towards, and we should say that we should be proud anti-Zionists in the sense that we're against settler colonial ideologies, we're against racism, we're against supremacism of one ethnic group or religious group over another. It's just completely at odds with any, and it's very clear in Israel, like their security minister is this guy called Ben Gvir, right? He makes Tommy Robinson look like, I don't know, like Jeremy Corbyn or something. Like, I mean, that's a bit extreme because Tommy Robinson, but they're both street fascists, they're like Ben Gvir's been done for street violence. He is literally you can't really, in terms of what he says, is very, very hard to distinguish him from a Nazi. There was a clip of him the other day saying, we can't let any aid in. This is that we need to starve them. And I mean, he says out loud what the logical endpoint of Zionism is. So
he seems to be the most honest Zionist.
Yeah, he was useful, and he's useful in that sense because Zionism, the mask is off now. And liberal Zionism, which was always a myth, and it's an oxymoron, but it was very powerful. It's unsustainable now, surely, in the face of what we've seen, because it's not. This is a project which is. There's no way you can establish a majority Jewish state on a land which was populated by majority Palestinians without everything you've seen and without it veering towards what you're seeing, which is genocidal fascism. And arguably, it was there already. If you look at what Ben Gurion was saying, was the first prime minister. It's not that different. If you look what Menachem Begin, who was Likud prime minister in the 70s and 80s, what he was saying, like this isn't new. It's maybe a bit more extreme with people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and with the genocide, but the seeds of it have been there since the start. And
I think that's absolutely right, because people try to make these distinctions between different forms of Zionism, but there isn't any real distinction in the ultimate end goal. It's just a question of methods. It's about how extreme are you in achieving that goal. I mean, you mentioned the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben Gurion, and he said that he would accept a partition plan because that would serve as a stepping stone to colonizing the rest of Palestine. And he was a Labour Zionist, whatever that means. So, it was ultimately, in his mind, always a temporary thing, the idea of partition and two states. So the ultimate end goal of Zionist ideology, all Zionist ideology, is to colonize the entirety of historic Palestine. And to many Zionists, actually, to colonize beyond that.
Yeah, and also one of the main ideologues behind Zionism is Vladimir Jabotinsky, right, who wrote this famous essay in 1923 called The Iron Wall. And he's often pointed to as like the sort of intellectual godfather of the Likud party. But they all subscribe to that idea, which is that you have to basically kill Arabs long enough that they're scared of the Jews and they won't fight back, and they'll only from a position of complete strength will we be able to dominate and negotiate with the Arabs around us. That's fascism, right? and Jabotinsky was a admirer of Mussolini. But this is what I'm saying, like he's seen as a compartment of Zionism, but those ideas have percolated into all forms of Zionism. They're inherent to even liberal Zionism, you know, so-called liberal Zionism, because you can't, in a way he was right, you can't go and impose a supremacist colony on indigenous people without them fighting back. And the only way you can do that is to exterminate them or to destroy them to such a point that resistance is futile, which is what happened with the Native Americans. You know, there was massive revolts against the British in the Americas and the Spanish, but they destroyed them enough that they pacified them. So Jabotinsky's idea is inherent to Zionism. And again, this is all stuff that people are coming to see, you know, I think in the mainstream. And it's kind of sick to talk about successes in the context of what we're seeing, you know. I do understand that. But I do think it's worth saying that in terms of as you mentioned, actually, the propaganda war or the information war, or we're winning. The favorability ratings for Israel in the UK, the United States, even Europe, are the lowest they've ever been. There's a massive breach between the populations now and the ruling class on this topic. And the media, which has been doing the propaganda for the ruling class, it's not hitting home like it used to.
Well, just before we get onto that, because I want to explore that in a bit more depth, another point I want to address is Jewish supremacism, which is a term that's, you know, gaining currency in people's consciousness. Even after tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been killed in a live-streamed genocide, we're still bombarded with talk about anti-Semitism, Jewish safety, and the Palestinian writer Mohammed al-Kurd has written about this quite a bit. He said that those Jews who say that should go get therapy, and he's also railed against decades of coddling Jewish supremacy, and he's called out in quite stark terms people who prioritize Jewish safety, especially in the face of Palestinians being massacred and starved to death. As someone with Jewish family, do you think too much attention has been given to Jewish emotion and feelings? Is there, you know, any validity in that?
I mean, it's just in some ways, if you indulge, you're helping the genocide happen, in my opinion, because it's a distraction, and we know this. And you can see it in internal documents. You don't even need to look at internal documents. Look at any kind of institution which claims to be fighting anti-Semitism. They all operate as Israel lobby groups. So the weaponization of anti-Semitism is one of the major parts of the armament in the Israel lobbies and the Zionist movement's arsenal. But I think that's the reason. It's a propaganda technique. I don't like. It's not. If it didn't serve a use, they wouldn't do it. So,
but a lot of people seem to be sucked in by it. I mean, I'm not saying that, because often you see.
Yeah, but they know why that it's such a good issue to push when you're talking about the left or you're talking about progressives, because no one wants to be accused of anti-Semitism. Like, there is a horrific history of anti-Semitism. We had the Holocaust. If you put that as kind of if you put that as like the cost of speaking out, it does impact on people's speaking out. I think it has less use now, but there's a reason why it's the only thing that stuck with the Corbyn movement. You know, like they tried. If you rewind back to 2015, Jess Phillips was banging on about Jeremy Corbyn being a misogynist because he didn't appoint enough women to his first shadow cabinet. There was the whole like check agent thing. None of them stuck because the left kind of just said, "Shut up." That's not true. On the anti-Semitism thing, they, as we know, they didn't defend themselves.
And one thing I want to talk about as well and focus on is not just how the people being accused of anti-Semitism receive it, but also the way in which, among many Jews, you have this radicalization to the point where some Jews genuinely think they're under threat, which is.
But you know, they're getting like the actual communal organizations or the media, like the Jewish Chronicle, they're pumping like out endless propaganda. If you read the Jewish Chronicle, you would be, and you believed it, you'd be terrified, because you're being told constantly that there's anti-Semites everywhere, that they're coming to kill you, and the left is full of it, and full of them, and so propaganda works.
But what is our response to that then? To those people?
To those people is to try and educate them and say, look, you're being like, it's not just the Jewish community, right? Obviously, states understand this. Like the war on terror, they stoked up fear about Muslims. It's a very, very good way to control people. And also, when Zionism and Israel is such a monstrosity, if you hammer home the idea that you're not safe anywhere, it feeds into the Zionist narrative, right? Which is that you need a safe haven, otherwise you're going to be killed at any moment. So it serves all these different functions, and the Zionist movement has a long history of that. They want Jews to be scared in countries outside of Israel, so they make what's so-called aliyah to their homeland. So the other way I think we should approach it is, and in some ways I don't even like talking about this, because even indulging this anti-Semitism debate when there's a genocide going on, I feel is a distraction. I never indulge it, because I even if you're pushing back against it, you're still talking about something other than the genocide, which is what they want. But if we are going to talk about it, these groups make anti-Semitism much worse. And I think that's how we should approach it. We should say, look, if you are weaponizing anti-Semitism, you are making it much worse. So you're the one who's facilitating anti-Semitism. You're like, if you look at the ADL or the Jewish labor movement or whatever it is, all these groups that weaponize anti-Semitism to destroy critics of Israel, they make anti-Semitism much worse. So we should approach it from a position of moral superiority. Like I was saying this about Asa Winstanley's book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism. I believe that's a really powerful tool in the fight against anti-Semitism, because if you're combating the people that are weaponizing it for political purposes, you're making it easier to fight the real anti-Semitism, and they're making it harder. So I think that's how we should approach it. But again, as I say, like it's not something I think we should approach now. I mean, the Jewish feelings thing, again, is part of the same thing. Like if you look on Twitter, there's always these Zionists that say, oh, I can't even remember. Some of them are so silly. I saw like something that looked like a red triangle and it made me terrified. But this is all, I mean, it's propaganda. It's about making it about anti-Semitism or perceived anti-Semitism to deflect from the fact that we're looking at a state which calls itself the Jewish state committing a Holocaust in Gaza. Yeah, I mean, I stay clear of it now. Because I think it is a distraction. I think even if you push back against it, you're engaging in that distraction. It's just not relevant. I mean, I'm not saying everyone should do that. It's just my personal take on it.
Well, moving back to what we were talking about before, about the staying power of Zionist propaganda, of which unfounded anti-Semitism allegations are a part. We've seen this change in not just government rhetoric, but among establishment journalists and others as well over Gaza, such that people are saying that the dam has broken. Where before, people were denying Zionist war crimes and engaging in propaganda in support of them, there's now this condemnation and exposure. Why have so many people had this apparent overnight epiphany, this Damascene conversion over Gaza?
Well, firstly, I would say I don't think that in the mainstream it's happened on Zionism. You still don't see mainstream figures talking about Zionism or saying they're anti-Zionist, which needs to change. But in terms of criticism of Israel, from people like Piers Morgan and people who were effectively propagandists for 18 months, I think Israel has gone too far. They can't hide the images of starving kids. They can't hide the images of kids with their arms blown off. And someone was actually saying the other day, which I think is quite interesting, that it's the famine that has really, the engineered famine that has changed things. And in some ways, there is a reason for that, in that the famine is easier to talk about because it's kind of detached, rather than when you're talking about genocide with kids being blown up, who's bombing them. Like Israel claims that it's nothing to do with the famine, and you can kind of detach Israel from it. Obviously you can't, but within their heads. But I think these people are I don't care about them. Like, I don't think this is what the new party has to change. And this is what all our psychology has to change, which is that don't bother about the mainstream. They have a role, a structural role in the upkeep of the status quo. That won't change. Don't celebrate when Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart come out with a strong statement on the genocide 2 years too late. We don't care. They'll just go with the wind. They're not going to be any kind of influence on the kind of systematic change that we want. We need to concentrate on building up power within ourselves and understanding that we need to work outside those institutions and build alternative institutions. I still don't think we're there on that in terms of the new party, because Jeremy Corbyn's still writing articles for The Guardian. Why write articles for The Guardian? So the argument would be, strategically it's good because you reach more people. Well, these days, do you? Firstly, he's got millions of followers on Twitter, on Instagram. He probably reaches more people than you're going to get in a comment piece. Secondly, even if that was true, the downside is it instantly puts him in the bracket of the establishment in many people's eyes. And no one buys that now. Look at Donald Trump. You wouldn't have Donald Trump writing an article in the New York Times. Like, obviously, Donald Trump's politics is very different, and I don't agree with any of it, but his whole anti-establishment, openly, explicitly, is why he got elected. It doesn't. People are shocked, well, maybe they're not shocked, but he gets into power and fills his cabinet full of Goldman Sachs after speaking about Goldman Sachs. But the point about Corbyn is he can speak these terms and actually really he'll have the policies to back them up. So it's perfect. Don't engage with people like The Guardian, who were, by the way, the leaders of the anti-Semitism campaign against him personally and the Labour Party under him. Discussed it. Jonathan Freedland is a columnist for The Guardian, was former executive comment editor. He was a long-term friend of Mark Regev, who's like the former right-hand man of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Until very recently, he was a columnist at the Jewish Chronicle,
exactly.
which is essentially an
I didn't leave because of its pro-genocide position. He left because Elon Perry, or supposedly that's his name, but
Eli Litvrak, I think his name was.
Yeah. By the way, I interviewed him before we knew about the scandal. It was quite interesting. But anyway, all that, like, it's immoral. It's immoral for a start. I just don't understand, but I don't want to engage too much in like tit for tat and all that stuff. I do get that we got to unify and stuff, but we need to get some ground rules down and understand that even from a political strategic point of view, we shouldn't engage with the mainstream. I'm not saying don't be interviewed by them. Fine, be interviewed by The Guardian, be interviewed by the BBC, whatever. But when you're actually writing stuff, publish it in Tribune or, I don't know, anything, Canary or Navarro, or whatever it is, like something that's not part of the mainstream establishment.
Well, there's no shortage now of independent media outlets that Jeremy Corbyn could have chosen. And this is, important, I think, because this is a clear example of where lessons have not been learned.
Yeah.
I remember quite vividly when Jeremy Corbyn announced his intention to resign as Labour leader back in December 2019. The first article he put out was in The Observer. And now 5 years later, he's put this article out in The Guardian. And, we need to have these sorts of discussions. And I think, unfortunately, people can't seem to differentiate between criticism and critical support.
Yes.
We support a new political force in Britain that's going to get us all out of this hellscape, but it needs to be done in a way that learns the lessons from last time, because many mistakes were made last time.
And also, the other thing is a political project doesn't work if you don't have a space for supportive criticism, because it just becomes calcified. And in fact, that's kind of what happened with the Corbyn first time round. So we have to, but it goes to the heart of something which one of my main bugbears with the discourse in modern times is that you can't have a disagreement politically without people saying that you hate each other or that it's a personal attack or something. Like, we're not in a cult. Like, I hope I don't agree with one person about everything, any person in the world about 100% of things. So when you have a party of 600,000 people now signed up or whatever, you're going to have vast disagreements. We need red lines on certain issues, but like there's going to be vast amounts of, so we need to have a culture where you can speak openly. Part of it is social media and Twitter and stuff, which is why I don't really engage in back and forth on Twitter, because it's just you don't ever get anywhere and it becomes a personal thing. But tactically we have to, because as you say, like it seems like mistakes are being made again on many different things, and unless we talk about it in a critical way, then it will just go further and further down the line. And just to go back to something which I was thinking about, what you were saying about the changing discourse and the fact we couldn't say anything during the comment. You couldn't even use the word Zionist. It's quite amazing to think that that was seen as anti-Semitic. And in fact, Owen Jones released a video, I can't remember, during the Corbyn years, where he said the left should not use the word Zionist because it could be misinterpreted as being for all Jews. That's quite an amazing victory for Zionism if you make even the enunciation of your ideology unsayable. And that's changed. So to link it to the new party, we need to have an environment where we can talk openly about what Zionism is, that we are anti-Zionists, that it's not a risk to Jewish people. In fact, many Jewish people are anti-Zionists. I don't know how many, that's arguable, but probably less now. And there was an article recently in the Jewish Chronicle about how all these Jewish parents were having these arguments with the anti-Zionist Jewish kids, which was quite hopeful. But the door has not been open like this before, probably since the start of the Zionist movement. And it's open now. So we need to push through because we might not get the opportunity again. And in the long term, I think that Israel's lost. Like the Zionist project they've gone too far with this. There's no way back for them now, in my opinion. Like there's not, in previous massacres, like in Gaza in 2014, 21, they haven't gone on long enough, and they definitely didn't reach anywhere the levels of savagery of what we've seen recently. But even in those times, I was like, well, this is different now. People are seeing, and then it went back to how it was before. I don't think that's going to happen now. And it's our responsibility to have a political vehicle where we can make sure it doesn't happen. Because the Labour Party, again, to go back to its relationship with Zionism, the Attlee government was the one in power when the Nakba happened. And the mandate was ended in 1948. So they're
of course,
responsible.
stalwarts of the Labour left, even people like Tony Benn at that time, supported the creation of
Exactly.
the Zionist regime.
Yeah,
So.
and it's never been different, So we have to understand, and this is a really important point that I think is really optimistic, is that the Labour Party's role within our society is to absorb and neutralize any kind of liberatory left in this country. And they've done it successfully for many, many decades, right? And it was revealed more explicitly than ever under Corbyn. So I kind of think that it's impossible. It was always going to be impossible for Corbyn to do that. But the interesting thing is they wanted to get rid of him early, right? The chicken coup in 2016. The fact he was in for 5 years, he became the most mainstream left figure there's been for many, many years. That was a mistake. That was something that shouldn't have happened within the system, right? And now we can use that mistake, the fact that we have this figure who is known, and we can start a new party in a way that we've tried before and it's never worked. But we've never had these conditions, and we've never had a Jeremy Corbyn figure. So if you start a new party without all that baggage of what the Labour Party comes with, the fact that it's actually set up to destroy you, there is a lot of hope in that.
It is completely unprecedented.
600,000. I mean, and I was one of the ones that was saying for ages, you need to start a new party for this reason, because there's all this disillusionment with the mainstream, and it's all being funneled to the reform because there's no other vehicle apart from the Green Party, which I actually don't think is the way forward. But they took too long. But the proof of the fact they needed to do it before is the fact that within a week they've got 600,000 members, and it will keep going higher. This is before they've even got a name. So and then you get people like Paul Mason saying this is comparing it to like the communists putting the Nazis in power in Nazi Germany. But the fact is, it's, as is the case often with that guy, it's the opposite of what he says.
I mean, I don't think we need to pay too much attention to Paul Mason.
No, but because the argument it'll get in is that some people like him, but yeah, as you say, he's irrelevant. But there's going to be a lot of people making this, is that to create another party, you're going to split the vote and allow reforming. The only way we're going to stop reform is to actually have a vehicle, an anti-establishment vehicle on the left to mirror it, which will stop it. And so,
well, it would take lots of votes off of it, I would have thought, because lots of the policies that I think this party would put forward, and obviously there's no policies yet, there's not even a party yet, but I think a lot of the policies that I think it would put forward would resonate with people inclined to support and vote for reform. And we saw that actually during the Corbyn leadership. In 2017, and 2019 in those general elections, a Corbyn-led Labour Party got more votes than Keir Starmer did in
Can I just
2020.
add something to that as well about the hope? Like I lived in Mexico for a year, and I was there when Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador lost in 2012, and he created his own party in 2014, right? Because he was part of the PRD, and the PRD was a more establishment sort of center left party, and they were he was saying they didn't support him because that election was stolen from him, which it was, by the way. I watched it live on Mexican TV, and they announced it after like 0.5% of the vote had been established, and it actually had it stolen the previous time in 2006 as well. But anyway, so he was like, I can't do this within the confines of this party because they haven't got the gumption to get it done. He created his own party, Morena, in 2014, and within 4 years, he was president and left the presidency as the most popular president in Mexican history. His successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, is now the president. She won a massive majority again. So, and the whole Mexican system was set up to stop that happening, but he created his own party to do it. So there is hope in that. There is hope, and obviously we see it. I know you're very interested in Latin American politics. All the left governments that came up with the pink tide all created their own parties to do it. They didn't do it within the established system, and the proof's in. We haven't had one anti-imperialist, non-Atlanticist leader of the Labour prime minister. So why does anyone think that's going to change if we continue to have Labour Tory? You have to break the system, and this is what's happening. And I'm really hopeful about what's going to happen. Obviously, it allows in elements like reform, but to be honest, there's not much like Labour basically set all their policies based on what reform was saying anyway. Just in reaction, all their policies are based on focus groups and Daily Mail front pages. So I don't think it's going to be that different, you know.
Well, absolutely. I think this could be a once in a century shift in the British political system, depending on, what happens, of course. If things are done right, if lessons are learned, if certain advisors who were, let's say, more responsible for the failures of the Corbyn project are not active in this one, I think there's some hope for this new party.
Yeah, I think, and to go to what you're saying about advisors and stuff, I think what has to happen is it has to be very democratic in that we guide it, the members, rather than have whoever the advisor. Even if we agree with the advisors, we shouldn't have a structure where advisors have overwhelming power over decisions, policies, that kind of thing. Like going back to the anti-Zionist thing, I don't know how many of the 600,000 have signed out anti-Zionist, but if there's a majority of us, then there might be a mechanism for us to make sure that it launches as a anti-Zionist party. I don't know, but the whole point is we have to have a system that is democratic, because that's the only way to ensure that it stays independent and stays outside the co-option of the British state. Because the other thing people need to understand is that the British state excels in co-opting independent political movements, and a very, very good example of that is the Scottish National Party, which in the work I've done for a long time now, I believe that the biggest fear of the British establishment more than anything else is Scottish independence, because it would just obliterate their pretensions to being an imperial power, that the whole thing would collapse. And if you see what the trajectory of the SNP, like many people now that think that they don't even want Scottish independence, they definitely don't have a pathway. They're not talking about a pathway to it.
Well, the SNP has also been tied up in lots of, I think, manufactured.
Well, exactly. Well, Salmond was exonerated. I don't know if you saw that recently for some of the accusations against him. But that happens because the system works to see off threats to it. And there's so many different mechanisms of how that happens. And then now there's actually a splinter party from the SNP called ALBA, which is more in keeping with the original SNP. But this will happen to the new party, of course, and the only way you can guard against that is to make it democratic, because if they can work on people, individuals, and there's no mechanism for us to hold them to account, then they will do that. But if there's a whole army of 600,000 people that there's some porous movement between our opinions and the leadership, then it's much harder for them. And as you say, it's a historic opportunity. We have to get it right. We have to. Like, if you look at history, the centre's collapsing like it has done at various different times in history. And what way we go now is up for grabs. So if we get the vehicle right, then we can win. I do think we can win. I don't think it's like I mentioned AMLO. Like, I know it's Mexico and it's not the UK, and we've never had an anti-imperialist prime minister, but times are this crazy.
The biggest political changes, I think, happen when opportunities arise, when moments are taken advantage of. It's not always a slow process of careful planning and implementation. Sometimes shocks happen, and then those shocks provide avenues for the greatest change. But that's also when people have to keep their wits about them the most. But unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So thank you very much for joining me today, Matt.
Good to chat to you again.
And thanks to all of our viewers and listeners. See you on the next one.